This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
Thanks for downloading the In Our Time podcast. For more details about In Our Time and for our terms of use, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Hello. In today's In Our Time, I'll be discussing the role which architecture has played in public life. Whether in homage to an individual or as a monument to an institution or ideology, architecture has always been a potent symbol of wealth, status and power. From castles to cathedrals, from the pyramids to Canary Wharf, architecture has served to glorify and often exemplify in some way the animating ideal of the time. So why is architecture such a powerful form of expression? How much can buildings tell us about a country's idea of its past and its present identity? And what does the architectural history of London in particular reveal about our own country? With me to discuss this is Adrian Tinniswood, architectural historian and author of Visions of Power and His Invention So Fertile, A Life of Christopher Wren. Gavin Stamp, senior lecturer at the Mackintosh School of Architecture in the Glasgow School of Art, and Julian Darley, architectural historian and biographer of Sir John Soane. Gavin Stamp, why do you think that public architecture is such a powerful form of expression?
Because architecture can be big and it lasts. Other things fade away, but dictators and emperors have built for centuries, if not millennia.
So you think the reputation of architecture, the reason we're talking about it now, is basically because of the monumental aspect of it?
Well, people look back and see the monuments of the past, and they want to emulate them as they last.
Do you think that the impulse for this monumental building has been the same through different sorts of civilizations?
No, well, I think it varies, obviously. The medieval civilization produced great cathedrals, very curious buildings, the more one investigates them, rather different from the big personal statements that modern monarchs and dictators have put up.
Do you find there was a collusion, when you think about people in the past, between the ruler and the architect, that they consciously said to each other, we're going to be remembered, and so we will build this massive great block of stuff?
Oh yes, I think all architects long to work for dictators. Le Corbusier did, for all his talk about democracy. He really wanted to work for Vichy France so he could have big things going up. Architects love it. Hitler was the perfect client, or Ceausescu.
Yes, but before Hitler and Ceausescu, if we go a little way back, say, through 2,000 or 3,000 years, there were no architects, were there? So who are we talking about then?
Oh, there must have been architects. People have always designed the building.
There were people who built, but actually, and you know but more about this than I do, but the idea of an architect popping up and saying, I will do that and I will work in collusion, didn't really work like that. Not with Akhenaten, for instance. I guess not with the people in earlier civilizations. There were builders and there were rulers who made the buildings. So my interest at the moment is more in the rulers than the architects.
We don't know the architects' names. There were always people who designed. There must have been. Buildings that don't appear. There used to be a myth that somehow happy craftsmen got together and ran up cathedrals. Those cathedrals were designed. Except we don't know their names, except for the later Middle Ages.
You're still staying in a rather late period for me. If we go back to Akhenaten, for instance, Adrian Tinniswood, the great Egyptian temples at Luxor, Karnak, and on which I think eventually the Roman temples were modelled. We'll start properly in Rome, but let's start there. Who was the architect there and then, and why was Akhenaten building those sort of temples, and his predecessors?
Again, as Gavin says, we don't know. There are workmen, there are masons who double as surveyors, who do some design work, and also who work with, Akhenaten worked closely with his craftsmen, his clerks of works. A good example of the relationship between architect and client in ancient Rome, if you like, is Hadrian. When Hadrian set out some ideas for the Pantheon, he approached the architect Apollodorus and asked him what he thought, and Apollodorus said it was lousy idea. So Hadrian had him killed and carried on, because you could do that when you're an emperor.
Yeah, but we're still dodging around. Gavin's replied to the first question, architects always want to be remembered. It was true, and so on and so forth. But just to get back to it, it's like the impulse I don't think comes from the architects. I'm trying to get where it comes from. I don't think architects say, I will build Karnak, or I will rebuild Rome in marble, or I will build Chartres. It's powerful people who do that. And do you think that they consciously are making these buildings, it's the final time I ask this question, consciously making these buildings in order that they are remembered in posterity? Or
Yes. Unequivocally, yes.
So one doesn't necessarily agree with you. They're trying to worship something in the terms of religious people, aren't they? In Egyptian times, they're trying to show that they are the son of God. for instance, Akhenaten.
But you're
Or
assuming...
Son of the Sun, sorry.
But you're
Son of the
assuming
Sun.
that buildings have a single function. I mean, buildings can work on different layers. They can work on different levels. Shah Jahan, when he built the Taj Mahal, it was a mausoleum for his beloved Mumtaz Mahal. It was also a huge personal statement about his own power. And it could be both those things.
Okay, well, let's start with Rome then, properly. Hadrian reassembled Rome in a way, although he put his name on only one of the many buildings that he did, as I understand it. What were the defining architectural features of the Roman model, and why do you think it has been so pervasive ever since?
Well, I mean, the defining features, I mean, if you want to go into classicism as such, I mean, if we want to talk about sort of columns and orders and porticos, we can. I mean, I think the reason it's been so pervasive is that it was the original, certainly in terms of Western civilization, which as far as our history is concerned means, is the big one. Roman architecture was ubiquitous. You could walk into a forum in Libya or Lebanon, or you could walk into a circus in Britain, or a temple in Portugal, or anywhere around the Mediterranean basin, and feel at home at the height of the Roman Empire, because the architecture unified. It made you part. It made you part of the Roman Empire, no matter where you were.
So, do you think that worked because Rome was powerful for several hundred years, and because it was not so much the architecture as the power of the authority behind the architecture?
Yeah, sure. Because I mean, Rome was one of the first civilizations to realise that architecture could unify. That architecture could. You've got an incredibly disparate group of peoples and races and nations under the Roman aegis, and architecture brought them together in the same way that language did. So, I mean, if we were having this conversation about Latin, it would be. Nobody would be raising any eyebrows. It would seem perfectly sensible that a language unifies a culture. And architecture is doing exactly the same thing in classical terms.
Of course, they had a visual language, which was sort of codified in books. The one that's come down to us is Vitruvius, where the way you use the orders is clearly laid out. So that was a manual, and there must have been others, which could be used all over the Roman Empire.
And there are rules. I mean, and because they were codified, as Gavin suggests, because they were codified, you could reproduce them very easily, couldn't you?
This reproduction reached way down into our own century, didn't it, Julian?
It did. I mean, the codification that Gavin's just mentioned, I mean, you start with the Renaissance treatises, and then you have a continuous replication and sort of a further enrichment of this classical language with a huge sort of baggage of what it all conveyed, and the whole idea of hierarchy, which becomes, very sort of, once you get into academic training of architects and you get into an architectural profession, so we could say roughly, as it were, from the middle of the 18th century onwards, it's
the idea of
absolutely redundant.
monumentality introduced by the Romans was imitated by other, like, say, Speer was going to try to imitate it or exceed it, wasn't he? In Berlin, he never succeeded in doing it, in Capitol Hill, Common Plaza. Was that because the architecture itself was so attractive, or was it because they wanted to be as powerful for as many hundred years as the Roman Empire had been?
Well, obviously they were, yes, I mean, they were pulling on every associative sort of string they could get. I mean, the best one really is Mussolini, who, sort of scythes his way through Rome, removing all the what he saw as the detritus of, the sort of intervening period, to reveal Rome as the fascist city. And I mean, that's the clearest one really of all in our own century.
The curious thing is, of course, he made Rome more Roman than it ever was. I mean, we all say that Napoleon, Louis XIV, Hitler, Ceausescu look back to ancient Rome, but of course ancient Rome never had a great central axis, that boring long vista. You look at the great model of ancient Rome, several of them that are in Rome, and of course it's very complex, irregular spaces, irregular disposition of buildings. The straight line obsession is much more modern. I think it's Louis XIV's France.
And Sixtus V's Rome as well, I think. I mean, the Christianisation of the classical ideal.
I'll come back to Julian Darley for a minute. Do you think that when architecture represents political power, do you think there tends to be one look, one defining look about it?
No, I don't think so. I mean, you mentioned Capitol Hill. Well, that's the sort of, that's the central point of L'Enfant's plan. L'Enfant's plan was, of course, based, sort of Versailles lay behind that. And there's a continuous sort of exchange and sort of modification of a vocabulary. It's a very wide vocabulary, and then it takes on the vernacular of the country, the nationality. It lends itself to actually sort of conveying nationalistic intentions. I mean, you can reinforce a sense of nationhood.
Establish a nation, as Christopher Wren said.
And, I mean, it's no accident that sort of in the 18th century they were busying about trying to make up a French order and a British order or Britannic order, in order that they could actually sort of, as it were, lift their leg on it in a doggy sense.
Are we talking about conscious power? Are we talking about people saying, we will use this in order to display, exercise, continue our power? I mean, you can put three interpretations on William the Conqueror's White Tower, for instance, which does all those things. Do you think that is the driving force in monumental architecture throughout?
Can I just say, I mean, in the 20th century, it very clearly is that I mean, you have Chusev, who was Stalin's architect, saying we are the direct heirs of Rome. You have Hitler, when he heard that the Palace of the Soviets was going to be bigger than his Great Hall in Berlin.
Promptly invaded Moscow.
Invaded Moscow and said that'll put a stop to their building. I mean, he said that. That will put a stop to their building. I mean, that's fairly unequivocal, isn't it? I mean, that's fairly sort of upfront. That the building mattered to Stalin and to Hitler and indeed to Mussolini. I mean...
Is it, once or twice it's been mentioned as already in this discussion, Louis XIV, the Palace of Versailles. How important, Gavin Sam, how important and influential was that? Because you referred to it 2 or 3 times. It is, in many ways. Can we just talk in a little bit of detail about why that was important?
I think it was important because, of course, it represented power, the power of the most powerful monarch in Europe at the time. And I think it also represents so many of the ideals of the Enlightenment, I think, with its interest in geometry, all those avenues and roads converging on the centre of the palace. That appealed, I think, to the 17th century mind, especially the geometrical side.
And somehow the French were so much better at doing these things. I mean, look at the Invalides, it appeared... within a very, very short period of time, 4 or 5 years. When we tried to, I mean, in this country, Greenwich was the emulation of the Invalides, and it took decades, just like the Channel Tunnel. Really.
Well, we'll come back to that in a minute or two. There's a national and distinctive and quite important reason for that, isn't there? Let's just talk about Versailles for a moment or two. Why did it become such an envied template? Oh, it's massive, yes, that's one thing. It's enormously rich, that's another thing. There's a lot of gold, that's another thing. But it was the layout, wasn't it? It was the idea that the centre of this great web was a person who could look down on through avenues and be, as it were, control.
Yeah,
all
I mean,
saw.
the Baroque is about absolute power, isn't it? I mean, as an expression of an architectural style, it expresses absolutism because the apartments stretch out to either side of a central point. The grounds stretch out beyond that. They radiate out so that, like the Sun King that Louis XIV was, the rays of his eminence and power spread out across the country.
I do think it's wonderful when things go around and come around. We're talking about the Sun King, and I'm still in the back of my mind is Akhenaten.
You've still got Akhenaten there, haven't you?
He's the son of the king, and it keeps going. It doesn't have to keep going on, doesn't it? We've turned to London once or twice, so let's look at it in more detail because it is its own story. Adrian, after the fire of London, 1666, Christopher Wren had a plan to redesign London along, as I understand it, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, classical Roman lines. First of all, how would it have looked if Wren had got his way?
Let me just correct there a moment. I mean, Wren did indeed have a plan, but there were at least eight plans for London. Probably there were dozens and dozens of models for London. I mean, I'm sure everybody was doing it. Every sort of country squire was building an ideal city.
If we can stick to Wren, we might get somewhere. So what were Wren's plan?
Wren's plan was to produce a series of... I mean, most of those other models, just to go back to them very briefly, most of those models were gridiron models. That was the easiest way to redesign a city, as on a gridiron. Wren adapted a gridiron and zoned the city. I mean, Wren has a commercial district centred around the Royal Exchange. He has a cathedral of commerce in the Exchange. He has a long vista through to a new St Paul's Cathedral and further vistas down to the Customs House and the river, the London Bridge. So you've got this sort of triangular arrangement, and you've got a series of districts.
Why didn't it happen then, Gavin Sam? Why didn't these plans materialise?
Well, I think London had more sense. It was a rotten plan. lot of straight lines, and that's the way people thought at the time. I think what's interesting is, of course, he did it in a couple of days, soon found out that the commercial interests in London were more important, that people wanted their own plots back and wanted to rebuild as quickly as possible, and Wren put it in a drawer and never referred to it again, because he was a sensible, pragmatic man.
I think you maybe skipped over the real reason, but the real reason was that there were freehold property rights. I mean, you please correct me. Freehold property rights, a great number of them, which is one of the things which Julian referred to earlier, why we find ourselves in a different case from Bucharest and Leningrad and Moscow and Paris. And people tenaciously held on to these, which made it difficult to run straight lines through them as Haussmann did in Paris. And that is one of the fascinating things about it, like it or not. And Charles II had said, after the fire, I'm not going to let any of you down, or better words to that effect. That was the stumbling block, rather than people saying it was a rotten plan.
It wasn't a very good plan, but indeed people wanted to rebuild on their own plots immediately.
Yeah,
they
sure.
weren't going to give up their property rights.
But they weren't allowed to. They weren't allowed to. I mean, straight after the fire, there's a blanket ban on all building for 6 months. The problem also was that nobody knew what the property rights were. Nobody knew who owned what. And, of course, the vast majority of property was tenanted, or it was let and sublet and sublet. So it was a legal nightmare. I mean, there was a point in September after the fire, there was a rumour going around that Charles II was going to buy London. He was going to buy the whole darn city and let Wren do it. I mean, it was an absurd rumour, and it could never, ever have happened. Exactly. The last thing in the world
Do
he
you
could
think
have
that
done.
Gavin obviously, and I'll come back to that in a moment because it's fascinating, he obviously thinks the consequences of that were a good thing. Julian, do you think the consequences were a good thing for London?
I do, because, I mean, it was actually quite a sophisticated process took place. Once the plans had been put back in the drawer, surveyors were appointed, and surveyors were appointed both by the city and by the king. So there were relatively large numbers of people with professional expertise, and this is the 1660s, to carry out a huge, Hooke, for instance, Robert Hooke, was a surveyor. And somebody's calculated, 1,000 upon 1,000 of properties he surveyed by staking them out. Which is a sort of, it does imply a certain respect for the individual's rights in the matter. And I think that's what lingers out of all that story.
Come back to you, Gavin. What do you think, what benefits flowed then from the abandonment of the plan?
There were small benefits, but London wasn't quite rebuilt as it was. But I think it is, as Gillian suggests, it's a respect for the individual. London has always resisted the grand gesture. In the 18th century, though you had new estates being laid out on gridiron plans, the estates owned by different aristocratic landlords don't quite correspond. In the 19th century, you don't have the Haussmann-like boulevards. The Metropolitan Board of Works push through some pretty ugly streets, but they bend. They're pragmatic. Even the great John Nash...
See, bending is pragmatic and a straight line is not pragmatic.
I think so.
I think that's a programme. Yeah. I think we have to pass it now, but I actually think that's a programme. Right.
But the great John Nash, who I think is the one great town planner that England's produced, again, compromised. He fitted Regent Street carefully between fashionable Mayfair and sleazy Soho, and made it go round Lord Foley's property, which is why you've got All Souls Langham Place just round the corner from here in Broadcasting House, a kink, and then other picturesque effects.
I bet the BBC will love you for saying that. You live in a kink.
Well, that's a bend. It was a pragmatic bend. And again, the quadrant round to Piccadilly Circus. It's not the great straight line, not the French method, which of course is laying a ruler down on a map, drawing two straight lines and demolishing everything in between.
But there's a bit of knockabout going on here, I've got a feeling.
That is the method of urban planners everywhere, isn't it? If one looks in New York or Philadelphia, the urban planner loves the straight line.
But the relationship between London and Paris, which has been this kind of love affair, which started in the 17th century, and you can, Evelyn, Wren too, go to Paris, and they are blown away by what an architect can do with power behind him. And the thing goes on and on. It goes, the minute that Napoleon turns his attention to Paris, you have Nash and Soane green with envy, Soane in particular, because just about all his grand plans never got beyond paper, because he didn't even have a royal patron. The Prince of Wales wasn't very interested in Soane. He was much more, Nash was much more fun.
But in London at the time, let's say after the Restoration, let's drift on a bit and be easy with centuries, as we can be on a programme like this. If we're talking about power in architecture, would it be right to suggest that power was demonstrating itself mostly through the private building of great and grand houses inside London?
Well, that was certainly one place that you could find the sort of embodiment of power, whether you talk about the great houses looking over Green Park or, I mean, there's the sort of extraordinary story of Clarendon's house, which, in a slightly disingenuous way, he just said, well, I needed a house, I haven't got anywhere to live, so I built myself a house. And Mr. Pratt, who was conversant with what you had to do, hadn't built very much, built him a fine house. In 18 years, it had gone. And Clarendon too. So I mean that's about the closest.
That isn't getting
to
to where I'd like to get to. So
no.
Maybe what I'd like to get to is completely irrelevant to this conversation. But if I plug away, it seems to me that it's complementary to what Gavin was saying. That one of the big that the demonstration of power was through extremely rich people, of which we had many more because of Industrial Revolution, and they showed one of the ways they showed their power was not only the country. Everybody knows we've got lots and lots of country houses, but they were building great houses in the city, and this was an important development. Whether it was unique or not, we can talk about, but it was an important development. If I'm right, we can talk on a bit. If not, we'll move on to something else.
There's one point worth making, that they weren't building them in the city at all, really. That most of the great houses were being built in the western suburbs towards Whitehall, towards the centre of government.
In the new town, outside the city, not specifically the city. I'll give you
within the city, you've got a lot more sort of powerful corporate building. You've got the city, the company halls that are being rebuilt after the fire. You've got the Royal Exchange. You've got Guildhall, and these are civic. But
they don't seem to me to be expressions of power so much, really. They seem to be sort of places where things happen.
They were at the time.
You think so?
Oh, I'm sure they were.
The Guildhall an expression of power?
Certainly, yeah. No question. As indeed was the Royal Exchange. I mean, the poems written about the new Royal Exchange when it opened in the 1670s. This wonderful. It was a cathedral of commerce.
Gavin, what do you think about these houses? I'm getting a bit of a bore about these houses. I promise you the last question.
You're quite right. London, up until the early 20th century, had great private palaces, as did Rome, as did Prague, as did Vienna. What's interesting, in a way, and sad, is that they've almost all disappeared. And we just have a few left, like Spencer House and Lancaster House. But most have gone, because commerce rules London, and most of the great aristocratic owners of these houses sold up between the wars, when a huge number of them came down to be replaced by rather banal commercial blocks of flats. Commerce triumphs over other things.
Do blocks of flats always have to be banal and commercial, Gavin?
The ones when you look at what was on the site of Chesterfield House or Dorchester House, I mean, they're pretty rotten.
I have a feeling that a lot of our listeners live in flats.
That's right with flats. But if
High Point 1 and 2, Gavin, where do we stand on High Point?
I don't mind. This is,
but if Chesterfield House had
they haven't got time to come around and lynch you.
The great town house of the great Lord Chesterfield, Isaac Ware, wasn't it? If it had to come down, as it did in about 1930, well, I'd like to think it'd be replaced by a good building by a good architect. It wasn't. And that's the sad thing about the departure of all those great private palaces.
But isn't it about the departure of all their owners as well? I mean, this is what's happening, that the social structure moves on, and architecture is about people. It's not about buildings. It's always about people.
Just almost a digression here. The architecture of the Industrial Revolution, has always seemed to me to be in this country, perhaps in other countries, to be extremely interesting, a mixture of utility and real attempts to buy into classical models and other models. What was your view of that, Joan?
Well, that is a fascinating sort of episode, and it's a very short episode, when the first wave of industrialists are trying to, in a sense, infiltrate. And I mean, the one that applies to London, of course, is the Albion Mills, which were built with Samuel White designed and definitely had a financial interest. So he was a builder-developer, just like, of course, Nash was. Huge mill with a sort of all the classical features, rusticated base, pediments, and so on, standing not that far off from Somerset House on the other side of the river. So you had you had the government offices, the learned societies, and so on, facing the new world of industry with everything that building stood for, which was unbelievable productivity, possibly the loss of working men's livelihoods. So it was a sort of grandiose, a very difficult topic to argue, if you want, and then, of course, it goes up in flames shortly after, which solves everybody's problem, and then the word goes out on the street that it's been burned down by exactly those people who were losing their livelihood. But in fact, what it was they were overrunning the machinery, because the machinery wasn't properly tested. It was Bolton and Watt. And the actual enterprise was in terrible financial difficulty, so they were overrunning the machines in order to kind of catch up. And all the investors were sort of waiting around. And so the machine blew up.
But the stations and the King, all of this building around King's Cross, were, again, if we're talking about London, just coming to the end of a London section, brought the industrial architecture into this city, and I don't mean it in its limited city, Mayor of London in his carriage with his sense, Edwin. I mean, this brought it into this city with very interesting consequences. I mean, the most evident and outstanding now, of course, are some of the railway stations, I think.
Well, sorry, just when you're saying it brought the industry into the city, I mean, in fact, there was plenty of industry in the city before the railways.
Yes.
I mean, you know, John Evelyn was very big on
London's always been
keeping out of the smoke.
Keeping the dyers and the soap boilers.
Absolutely fine. I'm talking about industrial architecture then. I think it brought massive architecture into the city in a way that it hadn't been there before. So
it certainly brought straight lines in. To go back to that one, I mean, there's a limit to how
the largest buildings was industrial buildings, which people went to see because they were so amazing. Was the London docks, huge structures that you've got, some of the best ones of the early 19th century down the river. Certainly that's unprecedented.
So that's what I'm talking about, bringing it in after the Industrial Revolution, bringing massive architecture, which represented not a different sort of authority. It represented, it didn't so much authority as power. We're talking about the power of commerce here, mercantile power, which came into the city, into London.
With a bit of a classical dress, which in a sense ties it into the architecture, you know, that the clients were familiar with. I mean, that's what their houses, they were dressed that way. I mean,
Sure, and as indeed I mean, not only the railway stations maybe had a classical or a Gothic dress, as did the railway trains themselves. You know, they had classical columns on steam engines and Gothic arcading.
Of course, there was less of a division between the architect and the engineer. There were so many individuals. The prime example is Brunel, but there are lots of others who could do both very well. And the way you built an industrial building was with the language of classicism stripped down, arches and columns perhaps of cast iron.
We ended the authoritarian section by attempting to talk a bit about Versailles. Can we just talk about why the Houses of Parliament rebuilt in 1835 were rebuilt in that particular way, in that Gothic structure, and what that signified about London? Has anybody got anything to volunteer on that?
Well, Parliament knew exactly what it wanted. It wanted a building that represented the history of the parliamentary institution. It was a new way of looking at architecture, not just using the conventional classical language. Had the House of Parliament burnt down in 1800, I think we would have had a classical new Parliament by Soane, probably, or Smirke, or somebody.
Man would have got a commission.
But by the 1830s, such was the influence, say, of the novels of Walter Scott and the sense of history and the Gothic revival getting going, that the building, the centre of the nation, had to represent the nation's history. And so Parliament said that the style shall be Gothic or Elizabethan. So different from the way we've organised parliaments these days, when, of course, let's say the Scottish Parliament had no say whatever in the building was going to get. But with the rebuilding of Westminster, and the House of Commons...
So that's very interesting. So you think that Parliament is telling the country what it knows the country wants, and it's representing this country through that building. Can you just go a bit further? What do you think it was representing through that? You said Walter Scott and all that. That isn't quite enough for me. What else is it representing?
Well, they knew. I mean, there was all part of the idea that, of course, institutions in Britain, and in England in particular, evolve. And Parliament had sat in a royal palace and eventually taken over that royal palace. And, of course, the proper name for the building that Barry and Pugin built is the new Palace of Westminster. And it represents the Constitution, which has evolved over the...
Just a second, one second. When it was built, did people say, yep, that's what we want? Was it a whoopee feeling?
There was a debate about it in Parliament, but the general feeling, my impression is, that people were very happy with a great Gothic building. The pace was changing.
The other point to make, I think, is that just as classical, is a set of values, so is Gothic by this point. That Gothic architecture in the 19th century has Christian associations, whereas classical is pagan. Gothic is considered to be native English architecture, even though it's not. It's considered to be native English architecture
because of the churches.
Yeah, because exactly. And classical is foreign. So in an imperialistic religious age, Gothic becomes a much more appropriate. And also, we're starting to look to England's past as a more congenial place to live, if you like. That with the French Revolution, with the Industrial Revolution, with the politicised working class, with demonstrations, you're starting to find people looking back to the past, looking back to England's past and saying, I'd rather be there than here.
It has to be said there was a funny little sort of earlier episode. I mean, just about 10 years before the Great Fire, Soane started out building the law courts, which were, in fact, on the side of Westminster Hall, and a select committee of the House of Commons got him to actually demolish what he'd built, which was classical, and start again with something that they saw as Gothic, not as Gothic, of course, as Pugin managed in Barry, but still Gothic, something which was, pointy.
To harmonise with Westminster Hall.
Yes.
Which also, in 1835, was said to represent this country. It was said to represent its past, as you said.
It's interesting that William IV tried to give Buckingham Palace to Parliament. And
get rid of it.
Because he hated it. He hated it so much. And he said to the Speaker as they walked through the smoking ruins, he said, I mean this is a permanent gift, mind, a permanent gift. But they wouldn't have it.
Let's move finally in the final section to architecture and modernism, maybe even architecture and democracy. Gavin Stamp, do you think there is an association between architecture and democracy?
Not in terms of style. Absolutely not. There is a view which still prevails, somehow classicism represents authority and the modern architecture represents democracy. I don't think that is true. They're just different styles, and it's a matter of how these styles are used. In the early days, modernism was seen somehow representing a more, possibly a socialist, certainly a more egalitarian society, but in the end it has been imposed on people with quite as much ruthlessness as classical architecture.
But I would agree with that, actually. But in its intentions, it did intend, and Le Corbusier, it's easy to deride, and they did intend to make the buildings more available for more people, for the masses, as John Carey puts it in his excellent book, The Intellectuals and the Masses, than ever before. And I think it's worth talking about that impulse before we dismiss it.
That is true, and I think it's best expressed in the Festival Hall, which I think is one of the finest buildings of its time, and representing the ideals of the modern movement. But the idea of openness, accessibility, an architecture of the people without any of the overtones of monarchs of the past. An irony is that the great Italian modernist, Giuseppe Terragni, designed the Casa del Fascio in Como as a fascist building for Mussolini, one of the masterpieces of the international modern movement. He talked about this building being of glass to express the open nature of fascism. So there are always words can be used to justify it.
Modernism. It's also about your enemies. I think. I mean, the fact that Nazi Germany was so vehemently opposed to modernism gave it a certain credibility. I mean, Lubetkin says in 1940, I think, talking about Nazi Germany, he said a flat roof is an act of revolt. A horizontal window invites a call from the secret police.
Would you say that modernism has as yet has achievements in any way comparable with those we've been touching on as we've raced through the last 2,000 years? Julian?
Well, I mean, it's very difficult to talk about modernism in sort of a very, in a sort of, in a rigid way, because if you're looking at buildings that are being built now, we're talking about buildings which are sort of not anymore, I'm glad to say, sort of eclectic mud pies of this, that and the other in the way they were 15 years ago. But there is a very strong, clear kind of purposeful architecture which tends to be used for a lot of the new cultural buildings, a lot of the new lottery-funded buildings, not necessarily the ones that have gone up in huge lights, have borrowed a great deal from the central tenets of modernism.
Which
but
would
we're
be
not.
what, so people know what you're talking about specifically?
Well, I mean, Walsall Art Gallery is a good example of a really, a first-class building, beautifully built, expensively built, thoughtfully designed. I mean, you couldn't call it anything else but modernist in its essentials, but it's not what we think of if you think of sort of modernism as a sort of East German youth hostel. They're from the other ends of this, of the world.
On the other hand, in loose and general terms, when people were talking about a very modern city, they'd probably say, look at Manhattan. And when you look at Manhattan, what you want to look at are these skyscrapers, these great canyons of skyscrapers down 7th Avenue and the Wall Street and so on and so forth. Are we not back to power and authority as represented by monumentality and so on? Except we're worshipping, Mammon is in charge and not the sun disk or God.
Sure. I mean, you're not talking about democracy there. You're talking about, about globalization, about the conquest of capitalism, I think, which has given rise to some wonderful buildings. I don't mean to dismiss it. It's given rise to some wonderful buildings. I mean, to my mind, the skyscraper is the 20th century's great architectural achievement.
But there is an irony here, isn't there? We've been talking about how Wren's Wren's plan was defeated by commerce, and commerce was more important than authoritarian rule by the monarch. But now, in the end, commerce has triumphed, and of course, what upset so many people looking at London, that we no longer have that sense of propriety that monuments in a city, secular, the dynasty or above all the church, should dominate, and everybody is rightly upset that the Dome of St. Paul's is now overwhelmed by the towers of commerce, and it tells us a great deal about what we now regard as most important.
I think another...
Well, also it tells us, it might do, Gavin, but it also might tell us that there's a faculty that we have, perhaps overdeveloped in this country, perhaps the same as other countries, is that age gives to things not only an added beauty, but a sense of inviolability.
Yes, I think it should, probably. I think also the Dome of St. Paul's is the most beautiful dome of any...
Yeah, I mean, there is a kind of aesthetic, isn't there? I mean, there is an aesthetic standard that things...
You can't have both. You can't go around raising higgledy-piggledies of London 15 minutes ago, Gavin, and then saying higgledy-piggledy gets in the way of the best dome in the world,
I'm saying there is an irony there, as I said, and it's I'm not quite sure what the answer is.
Noel Coward said the bigger the buildings, the lower the morals.
I think one of the great ironies of...
Well, I don't think Noel Coward was particularly right, actually, was it? Do you think the morals are lower in Manhattan than they were in, I don't know, in Rome?
I wouldn't presume to say.
Well, you're here to talk about these sort of things.
But isn't the irony that we go to Berlin to see the Reichstag triumphantly rebuilt in a very symbolic way by Norman Foster, and then we come back to London and we see the mayoral office, which is a sort of, it's a pimple with kind of some of what you might call a kind of the main elements of the Reichstag reduced.
The new mayoral office, the office of Mayor Livingston.
I mean that. I mean the egg over the water, but everything reduced to sort of caricature proportions. So when you actually walk into the building and start the journey up, which in Germany it's a really wonderful journey because you go over in a symbolic way. You go above the seat of government. In the building here, you get to a second floor and you can't go any further. And there's no explanation as to why. And this transparent building turns out to be, in fact, completely and utterly solid.
We could draw quite a lot from that, couldn't you? But I'm not going to comment.
Of course, we could look at Paris again, as we keep the London looks at Paris, because Paris is scarcely a backward city today, but they have not found it necessary, except in one or two places, to lose the skyline. Paris has disciplined itself. For the best communal reasons.
I mean, London has, compared to most Western cities, most cities, hasn't it? I mean, London's had a lot more high-rise discipline, if you like.
But now it's all being freed up, perhaps because of the, in the end, unnatural power being exercised by certain architects over this government.
Yes, we started by, or I disputed the fact that, the very opening remark you made, that the reason why the monumentality and the continuation of architecture was so fascinating was because you said architects always wanted to remember, and I thought, no, it's mostly rulers and power people want to be remembered. But now it is architects, isn't it? I mean, you don't get a building, you get a Norman Foster, you get a Richard Rogers, and so it goes. So, am I right, and what's your view on that, Gavin?
Norman Foster and Richard Rogers exercise, I think, an unhealthy degree of power. I cannot think of any architect in British history who's quite as powerful as those two now.
Why is it unhealthy?
But I think it's I think it's aesthetically unhealthy because it means that other firms, younger firms, more interesting firms, don't get the work. And I find something very sinister about the Foster office with its 600 desks, 600 staff, churning out these buildings. And even Lutyens and Wren, the height of their power, never had such
Why is it sinister? Because the idea of some modern buildings being sinister is around as a thought. Why is this sinister? Why is 600 people more sinister than 60 people or 6 people?
I think because it's a great design machine, producing a lot of...
Well, if the design's good, what's the problem?
Think of the design machines that, I mean, Seifert is the company, we knew of, but there were hundreds in the sort of post-war period, the Treherne, Norman Prestons of this world, who nobody ever kind of went to their offices, nobody wrote up their buildings, and they just rose inexorably all over the country and all over London. So
Sorry, finish, Julian.
I just feel that. I think, large, huge organisations become atrophied, full stop. I mean, that's just a fact of life. But 15 years or so ago, people were saying, why is it the Norman Foster builds buildings overseas? Why are there no Norman Foster buildings in this city? And why did Richard Rogers, first build in Paris? We wanted them then, and
the architectural lobby wanted them. A number of journalists wanted them.
So where is architect? Are we going to finish this programme by saying that what we've reached is the state which Gavin Stamp had a start from? That it's all in the hands of the architect. It is architect dominated, and that's the position in which we find ourselves, for better or worse, depending on whether you like the Norman Foster oeuvre or you don't. What do you think? Just round the table, Adrian. What do you think?
I mean, I think we're in danger of forgetting that most architecture is an exquisitely ephemeral thing, and it comes and it goes. And a lot of what we're seeing, a lot of what we're seeing, and I do agree with a lot of what Gavin says, but a lot of the buildings we're seeing will be gone in 50 years, and there'll be new styles, there'll be new preoccupations and new sets of values. So I don't think we need to worry too much. I think we can afford to be sort of smugly complacent about it.
Oh dear. Right, Gavin.
Well, I suppose that's reassuring if you think that the architecture of steel and glass lasts less long than the architecture of stone and brick, which does seem to be the case. So perhaps I won't live long enough to see all the towers by Foster coming down. What a wonderful thought that would be.
Right, OK, Gavin. What about you, Julian? Any advance on these two?
Well, I just feel that, patronage is the key to it all. And where does the patronage come from? And there's a different kind of patronage at the moment. There's probably greater involvement in the quality of London and Britain as a whole. There's a slightly more refined view of what is quality than there was certainly when I started writing about buildings, in the sense of because we've had this enormous lottery-funded explosion, and all over the country people are seeing very decent buildings and sometimes really exceptional buildings rising in front of them.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all three of you. Next week we'll be discussing human nature with Steven Pinker, John Gray and Janet Radcliffe-Richards. But thank you for listening.
We hope you've enjoyed this Radio 4 podcast. You can find hundreds of other programmes about history, science and philosophy at bbc.co.uk/Radio 4.